webpage. For those who want to participate with questions and answers, please make use of the Q&A part of the Zoom, and this will not be live streamed, but please, webinar attendees, make sure you use your Q&A button to send us questions for Dr. Vicky Murillo. I want also to remind us that we are here at Stanford in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples, and Vicky is in Mannahatta, the ancestral land of the Lenape peoples, taken over in 1626. We offer our gratitude to the land, to the water, and to the air that surrounds us. I want to pay respect to the past, the present, and the future Ohlone and Lenape peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. Please support indigenous organizations donating time, money, and learn and encourage others to learn about the indigenous grassroots movements that surrounds us and are happening everywhere in Latin America and North America just now. Thank you also to Stanford CDDRL, the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, for co-sponsoring this book talk by Professor Vicky Murillo, who is going to be discussing her book, The Politics of Institutional Weakness in Latin America. Vicky is a dear friend, one of the colleagues I most admire in our profession. She's a professor of political science and international affairs and director of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. Her work touches on some of the most important issues of Latin America, including work on political economy, electoral behavior, policy, public policy, questions of institutional weakness. She has written books on distributive politics, on the politics of labor regulation, on public utility reform, papers on education reform, agricultural policies. There is no major area of the scholarship of Latin America that her work has not touched. Today, she's going to tell us about this very important work that she has been doing also with some co-authors. She has been working on these books with two books, in fact, with Daniel Brinks and with Stephen Levitsky. She also has a recent book called Non-Policy Politics, Richer Voters, Poorer Voters, and the Diversification of Party Electoral Strategies. This is with Ernesto Calvo, as well as several other books that you can go into her CIPA webpage in Colombia and take a look at her CV. So Vicky, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Alberto. It's a pleasure to be at Stanford. I love the way you introduce the seminar, especially given that Monday is the Day of the Indigenous People, October 12th. It reminds me that my father was an Aymara indigenous person, although he was quite assimilated. And certainly this is a very important part of what we do, and I love that introduction. I also love the opportunity to go there virtually and present my book. I love the cover of my book, so that's why I need to present it, to show it. I think the idea of the cover I like even more than the content of the book. And so the book is called The Politics of Institutional Weakness in Latin America. And this edited volume, so it's two books, a short book with the theory and an edited volume that just came out a few months ago, co-edited with Dan Brinks and Steve Levitsky, as Alberto said. And this was really the process of two conferences where we work with all the authors in the chapters of this book. And based on our starting point and their feedback and the important concepts and empirical strategies that they have, we devised a typology of institutional weakness and some hypotheses about the conditions that shape these political strategies of actors to adopt weak institutions. And the main takeaway point of the book is that institutional weakness is not a mistake, is not an error of institutional design, but a conscious political strategy that reflects power imbalances and how these are playing in the political arena. The book has a fantastic collection of chapters that touch upon different aspects of institutional weakness. There is a chapter by Calvo Negreto on instability of electoral institutions, another one by Alberto Sanmenaldo on constitution, one by Helmke on presidential legislative regulation, Holland works on coercion gaps for stream bending and property law regulation. Thun and Jensenius on gender violence laws. Amengual and Arjen on environmental and labor laws. Fernandez and Garay on environmental rules. Safon and Gonzalez on property laws in Mexico. Tulia Faletti on prior consultation. And Andrew Schrank on the area of labor safety regulation. So I really recommend all the chapters. And what's interesting for us is that we started with a conceptualization of institutional strength, which really was arguing that the strength means that actors are doing something that they would not be doing absent the institution. So that's the kind of the basic starting point. And that really generates 3 dimensions in looking at institutional strength. The first dimension is ambition. So how much does the rule change the status quo to make the actors change their behavior? Second, compliance. How much does the letter of the law matter? And third, stability. So how long do the institutions survive? And that's crucial to see their capacity to shape the expectations of actors. So let me, based on these 3 dimensions and the works and discussions in the conference, we came up with a typology that I want to introduce to you and some ideas of what produces these different strategies. Regarding ambition, we decided that institutions that do not really change the status quo are not ambitious enough to be strong, even if they are really applied. So these could be symbolic institutions that might have an audience value, but do not have an effect. And I think the example that we use is that of Potemkin courts based on the work of my co-authors, Daniel Brinks, and we use as an example Fujimori's constitutional court. The second dimension, as I mentioned, was compliance. And we have like 3 different types of non-compliance. One that's related to deficient enforcement. The authorities do not want to or do not enforce the institution or do it intermittently. A second, which is related to non-punitive enforcement, enforcement that doesn't really have a teeth. And a third one that is related to weak state capacity in relation to societal resistance. So first on deficient enforcement. We have different types of deficient enforcement. One, the most extreme, is what we call window dressing. That's institutions that are adopted with no intention to be enforced, but they're adopted to please a domestic or international audience. So one of the examples that we have is prior consultation laws, which are adopted overwhelmingly across the region. And we have a chapter on that in the case of Bolivia, originally adopted in the 1990s, not with the effort, with the idea that they were going to be adopted, but because they look good. And so Faletti says this is over time they would be activated, but initially they were just window dressing institutions. The second aspect of non-enforcement is forbearance. And forbearance is a selective enforcement that could be following electoral incentives. And here the chapter by Alicia Holland discussed those where the mayor might decide that for certain constituencies it's better to enforce anti-street vending regulations and for others to ignore them, or what she called coercion gaps. So the rules, for instance, of private property are very overwhelmingly approved by the nation and passed in the legislators, but when you got the time to evict someone and say a family at the local level, the mayor really, if you ask people, they don't really want that to happen. So there is what she calls a coercion gap that produces forbearance. Those laws are on purpose, not really enforced. And finally, the third type is what we call systematic selective enforcement. We have a chapter by Safon and Gonzalez on the Lerdo law in Mexico and how originally it's applied to the church lands, but not necessarily to the indigenous pueblos. Because they were political allies. And then once the commodity boom hits in the 19th century and the price of the land becomes more desirable for commercial agriculture and encroachment on those lands starts happening, private property law is applied also to the indigenous pueblos. So the emphasis on this intermittent enforcement or change in enforcement is that the authority has the decision to activate or deactivate the regulations. Another type of non-compliance is derived from non-punitive enforcement. And in this case, it's a case of design in which the sanctions are so weak that they do not change the behavior of the actors. You should think of them as a toll that you go through the highway, you pay the toll, better if you didn't have to pay the toll, but you keep going. And so the chapter by Garay and Fernandez on the application of forest law in Argentina discuss how in some provinces the fines for deforestation are so low that at least for commercial agriculture, the cost is so low that they just pay for them. It might dissuade the peasant, but certainly not commercial farmers. They just pay for the fine and continue with deforestation. So yes, the law on the letter it's applied, but the objective of reducing deforestation is not achieved. And finally, the third the third dimension on non-compliance that we look at are cases of weak state capacity. And here, when we look at state capacity, we always think in relational terms relative to society, because you might have a very strong state, but if there is a very strong societal resistance, think of the mask in the United States, it's very hard to apply. So certainly all types of compliance require societal co-production. The mask, for once, requires people to use the mask and be persuaded. But even if somebody needs to call the police for a robbery, you need to denounce the robbery. So there's always a degree of societal co-production. And in that case, we look at cases in which the state is not strong enough to overcome the resistance of society. And again, we have two different categories here. One is what we call a standoffish or indifferent states, a term that comes from the work of Dan Slater and others, and that's applied in the chapter of Amengual and Argent to the Latin American states. Are very common that they are relatively poor, have weak states, they don't have that many resources, so they have to choose where to apply the law, and they go where it's easier. In a sense, they're pushed by the wind and go where it's easier, where they get more cooperation from society or more demands from society. So for instance, in the case of a particular safety law regulation in the province of, I believe, Santa Fe in Argentina, they look both at the brick making and the construction industries, which are complementary, but the construction industry is unionized and it's a pretty strong union. And although work accidents are much lower there, all of the labor inspectors go there because that's where the union is demanding, and it lends them cars and makes their work easier. Whereas in the brick making sector, where the work conditions are much more risky because there's no union and this is a poorer population and mostly foreigners, they don't even send labor inspectors. So I'm exaggerating, they said fewer labor inspectors, but again, the state goes where it's easier. So that's one of the categories. The second category, it's a strategic category by rule makers, not by rule enforcers, and it's called aspirational laws. The chapter by Thun and Jensenius makes a very strong case that many times the rule makers choose rules not because they think they are going to be applied immediately, but because they expect them to change norms of behavior. So although at the beginning they will not be applied, the idea is that by having them on the book, they have a pedagogical value and they allow the supporters of the rule to make the effort to change society to the point to which they would be applied. And the example they have is actually laws against gender violence in Mexico. And they look also at survey evidence that shows that, of course, these laws are not applied evenly, and certainly there's difference across types of women. Over time, the ideas that they are supportive are changing and consider that gender violence is more of a crime, to be honest, and less of a private issue within families. So I guess the lesson of this dimension of compliance is the importance of societal co-production for either activate or deactivate the law. So in the enforcement, it was more of the authority decision. Here is more of the reaction of society. And finally, the third dimension of weakness that we look is what we call instability. Here we look at institutions that do not last for long enough. We have already drafted or coined the term serial replacement with Steve Levitsky in prior work, but we'd also think of the idea of repeal and replace. I think in the current polarized war, we are going to see more and more that changes in government are more likely to produce changes in policy that are not adaptative or incremental to try to adapt to new environmental conditions, but just shifts in policy preferences. And for instance, Calvo and Negreto chapter on electoral institutions shows that electoral rules are changed much more often in Latin America than they are in Western Europe, and they tend to be associated with shocks, with economic shocks, or changes in balance of power of political actors. So again, these are the three dimensions. I want to point out that we do not have a normative view that it's always good to have strong institutions. Certainly, we know that weak institutions are associated to many of the problems that we do have in the region, but you can have plenty of problems with strong institutions. In fact, the chapter by Menaldo and Albertus, it's on the constitutions made by dictators. And you don't want those to last, actually. You prefer them to be weak. But there's many others. I mean, you could think of the US Electoral College, or in the case of Latin America, the Chilean 1980 constitution, which lasted pretty long after the end of the military dictatorship that adopted. And many people argue that, in fact, it's the strength of these institutions that did not allow the degree of adaptation and responsiveness to the demand of society that produced the 2019 political protest and explosion in Chile. So certainly, there's not a single story. We think it's important to have some adaptability of institutions, and it might be that sometimes you find weak institutions to be better than strong, but in general, we notice that in Latin America, there tend to be many cases in which they are used to sustain power imbalances. Just before concluding, I want to point to certain conditions that we argue shape the incentives of political actors to use institutional weakness as a political strategy, because I also want to have time for question and answers. One of the things that we look at that shapes these conditions is the role of audience value. So when there is an international or a domestic audience that wants to see the rule, but cannot or would not monitor the compliance with the rule, that's a pretty strong incentive to have a rule that's window dressing, that will have low compliance. You can think of many rules, but most of Latin America has rules, with the exception of Cuba and Uruguay, forbidding abortion, and many times this is to please the Catholic Church or some other church. But in many countries, really, Argentina is, for instance, one example. There's very, 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 very rare that there is a sanction if you abort. That's not true if you are in El Salvador, right? But again, it seems that moving the law from the books has a cost. In fact, in the 2018 discussion on the abortion law in the lower chamber of Congress, those that supported the law said, well, nobody is punished anyway, is sanctioned anyway, so why would we need it to change, right? So that was even part of the conversation. But you can also think in the 1990s, all over Latin America, we see the adoption of many market-oriented reforms, the establishment of regulatory agencies, and a lot of times this was just to please, foreign debtors, to look modern and get access to foreign capital. And so there's many different audiences that would give you incentives to adopt rules that you don't really want to enforce. There's also something that's very common is disjuncture between rule writers and power holders. Many times those who have the power to write the rule have it for, very brief period of time. I think in Latin America, since the independence, those who had the power to write the rule always had the ambition to change society with the power to write the rule. And maybe Alberto has an explanation of what produced this tension. But then the power holders have different ideas, maybe because it's a federal country and the rule is established at the national level, and then at the provincial level or state level, the power holders have different incentives, or even at the local level, there are coercion gaps, as I just explained in the chapter by Holland, or maybe they're veto players, the military, powerful economic actors that do not allow you to implement the law. And the other dimension, a third condition that I think is important, the relationship between state and society in Latin America has been very deeply affected by high levels of inequality in multiple dimensions, right? Ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, gender, and so on and so forth, that have really, in the context of low state capacity and on the papers, republics all over, had really produced a lot of tensions, and tensions that are easy to modify with economic shocks. And there's then also plenty of economic shocks because this region is based on natural resources, or a lot of it is based on natural resources. So it's not so hard to have economic volatility and change in power coalitions that give incentives to modify either the activation or the activation of rules or the change of rules. And finally, there is an argument that Gretchen Hanke makes in her chapter about past dependency and what she called instability traps. The idea that certain that the behavior generates expectations of subsequent behavior, and you end up getting, certain institutions being less stable in the same country. So for instance, in Ecuador, Ecuador changes its constitution on average every decade, right? That's a lot, much more than the rest of the countries. So why is that? And what, that must have to do with path dependent mechanism. So, as I said, I wanna make of this more of a conversation and less of a monologue, but I really want to emphasize here that the objective of the book is to put together the idea that this is an important research agenda. This is a research agenda that the scholars of Latin America have discovered long ago, because there is variation in institutional strength within and across countries. And so they have been using empirical mechanisms to assess this variation. But it's not just restricted to Latin America or even to the developing world. We believe it has an important comparative value, and even in all democracies, not just in new democracies, even in advanced countries. I guess at the time where institutions are weakening in some old democracies like the United States, that becomes more obvious. And in fact, that's the direction that we think our work should take. So I'm gonna kind of stop here and open for questions and conversation.
Wonderful, Vicky. You have packed so many things into your conversation, and the the thirst we have now for reading the book, I think, is huge. One thing before we stop doing the web transmission, I do want to ask a couple of things, if you can clarify, and then we can go into the public, the audience questions, that we're starting to get several very interesting questions. But I want to ask you whether you can give us a little bit of a sense and explain to us the way you think of institutional strength. I think this was something you do at the very beginning of the book, and it is a very interesting setup because you're trying to really provide a metric and something about how an institution can be strong against the will of the veto players. So there is something very profound, I think, in the way you have conceptualized institutional weakness and strength, but I think it would be great if you could explain it to us, the way you conceive of institutional strength.
Oh, yes, thanks, Alberto. So the way we think about institutional strength in the abstract, of course, institutions are not born in the middle of nowhere. They're born without existing institutions, but there is like a status quo situation, and the way we think of the rule to understand if it's strong or weak is how much it moves the behavior of political actors from the kind of status quo situation into a new equilibrium. And so the dimension of, I should have I don't have a blackboard, but the dimension of ambition would make that the rule really doesn't want you to move a lot. There is a small distance between the status quo and the new rule. If there's like no distance, so for instance, I think some southern countries, Alabama has a law that forbids Sharia in government, but of course, nobody was planning to have Sharia in government in Alabama, so the rule has like zero ambition. Or for instance, we use the example of in Peru, there is, Peru had a plebiscite and passed a rule that there would be no re-election of legislators, but the rate of re-election of legislators before the rule was very, very low. So the effect of the rule is weak in the sense that it doesn't change a lot. The second dimension would be if the rule, moves you from to a very different equilibrium, to a very different situation. It asks for something that is hard to achieve. That means the rule is ambition. It's very ambitious, but it might be that you don't really get here. The actors really stay midway because there's only half of them comply, or they only comply half of the time. So that rule is weaker because it doesn't get all that it wanted to. It's still stronger than the non-ambitious one that didn't want much, but it's weak in the sense that it only gets half of its compliance. And then the last dimension, the dimension of instability, again, so you have the status quo, then comes a new coalition, they change the rule here, and then, you get repeal and replace, and you move back to the same place. So if you are an actor, you would know, and if this happens a lot, you would know that it's better to wait for the change in the rule. So the example I always want to give is nobody pays, not nobody, but unless you're charged in your payroll taxes, people in Argentina tend not to pay taxes if they can avoid it. And they always expect a change because there's like almost every government makes a tax amnesty. So they basically just expect the rule to change rather than changing their behavior. So if the behavior is going to change a lot and enough that you are going to be able to internalize that the cost of change it's lower than the cost of violation, you prefer to violate because you're going to be able to change the institution later on.
Thank you, Vicky. We do have to see that graph in the book, but buy the book and then you will be able to see the graph that Vicky is talking about.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a different thing, which has to do with like state capacity and political will. So it seems to me that one of the things you've done in this book is you're subverting the way we normally think about state capacity, that you are somewhat making the state more perverse than we usually think. It's not just that they're incapable, but they actually want, the whole forbearance work for Militia Holland seems to suggest that kind of, the state has this, intentionality in a way to make the rules not be complied with. But then there is also this dimension of political will. People often talk about, oh, well, the reason why something happens is because the president wants it to happen or doesn't want it to happen. And I wonder, when you think about this institutional weakness, is that because, in a way, politicians in Latin America don't want to move to a world where political will doesn't matter, where political will is the really crucial determinant of policy success or policy change?
I think there's both things. So political will matters, and in particular, variation on enforcement tends to speak of political will. The idea that you decide to deactivate the institution because either you have a constituency of poor people that benefit from street vending, or you have a constituency of rich people who do not want to see people selling stuff on the sidewalk when they walk out, or because you adopt a window dressing institution because you think it looks good and you are gonna get a seat in the UN or more foreign direct investment if you adopt the rule, but you really do not care or want to really enforce the rule and pay the consequences of changing the behavior. I think certainly there is a lot of space for political will from a decision from above in whether to activate or deactivate the institution. That's different from weak state capacity, when even though there might be political will to change behavior, the state do not get enough cooperation from society, or doesn't have the resources in the state relatively to what they need to really enforce the rule. So there might be, even if you don't think, so when we think of Latin America, we think of weak states. So really states where, the mail office doesn't get there. So we think about postal voting in the United States, but the postal service in the United States works, right? Anybody who comes from Latin America knows that you can put a check in the mailbox. The first time I did it, I stand by the mailbox until the mail person pick it up, and it gets there, right? That's not true in most countries in Latin America. So even though there might be really the will and the desire to expand mail voting, you cannot do it. There are countries in the region that there's no street address, the address, are not in the map. So that's a problem of state capacity. That's different from political will. So I think both things are important. The capacity of the state vis-a-vis society is important, and on the compliance aspect, and the political will and the will of authorities to really enforce the rule, both dimensions are important.
I love your example of the postal office, because it sounds like the possibility of the Latin Americanization of the US Postal Service, which of course would not be a good thing for such a professionalized institution. Let me now move on. Now we will stop the streaming service. Thank you so much for those of you who have connected through YouTube, but we will go into some of the questions from the audience.